Today on Lead with Bubba Scott, we're joined by John Nagler, a highly experienced high school history teacher, department chair, and someone who's spent his career thinking deeply about what it really means to educate. John and I first met when he was an intern fresh out of college, teaching in the history department at Groton School. Since then, his journey has taken him to schools across the country, from the Northeast out to San Diego, all the while honing his approach in the classroom as a leader and a mentor. We'll talk about moving beyond traditional lecturing, instead, helping students become thinkers, developing their voice, building confidence, and learning how to engage with ideas on their own. John shares his approach to a more democratized classroom, where students aren't just listening, but actively shaping the learning. This is a conversation about teaching, leadership, and what it really takes to help people grow. Let's get it.
Be with Bubba Scott. We're all learning how to lead. We've all got room to grow. Learn with Bubba Scott. From the leaders that we need, from the leaders we don't know.
John Nagler, or Mr. Nagler, as you're known in some circles. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Bella. Good to be here.
John Nagler, high school history teacher. You're the head of the history department. And before we get things going, I just want to ask a cold question for you. What do you hope students remember years after your class?
I would say when they think about the content of my courses, I hope they remember that there's always more to read. You're not done after you've taken a U.S. history survey, for example. You're not done learning U.S. history. Just scratch the surface. And I hope from me, they've learned the same thing that I learned from a lot of my teachers at Groton, which was you can be a history teacher. I wouldn't go so far as to say that I'm an historian and do other things. It's not just a monochromatic existence as some kind of nerd cloistered in the archives.
Well, yeah, this is great. Thanks so much for joining us on the show. So, as we get this thing going, let's just talk a little bit about the early influences on your life. Where are you from? Where did you grow up? And what are some of the things that helped shape who you are today from when you were younger?
I grew up in Indianapolis, Indiana, a big family of all boys. Got four brothers, two older, two younger. I joke with my mom that um, she's got a pretty freaking big carbon footprint, especially when you add up the lifetime totals of her sons. I went to camp in Maine, an outdoors camp, the oldest boys camp in Maine, and I think the combination of growing up in a household with high expectations and spending time in the outdoors in Maine opened my eyes up to the Northeast into prep schools. And as you know, went to Groton, went to Brown after that, went back to teach at Groton. Really, Groton, the experience there, along with my senior thesis, which got me back in the Groton archives, pushed me to become a teacher and encouraged me to go back to the classroom. And taken a couple small detours from teaching since then, never very far, but I've been teaching and enjoying my summer months off, mostly in the outdoors, since my early 20s.
It's pretty cool that you were able to go to camp in Maine all the way from Indianapolis. Can you talk a little bit about that experience? And I know while you were there, you got involved in woodworking, right? And ultimately, you ended up teaching woodworking at camp. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was just, they just had a little woodworking shop. The camp is on a small island in the middle of Maine, no electricity, no running water. So all the woodworking activities were just little projects by hand. Building boats, these homemade, I don't even know how you would describe design hippie boats, maybe. But camp was great. It was a 6-week camp, and it was like a bigger version of growing up in my household because it was all boys. It was about being outside. You lived in tents, big canvas tents when you were on the island, but mainly it was a tripping camp. And so I went on hiking, canoeing, and rowing trips all over the state of Maine and New Hampshire. And it's kind of a make-believe place. It's it was a great place to be a boy and a young man and get outside and get tough. I think it was still during an era at the camp where the emphasis was get tough. If you're wet, too bad. If it's raining, keep hiking. And I enjoyed that. It fit very much in with the kind of the way that I think in a lot of ways we grew up. My parents also met at the camp back in the 70s. My mom was a summer cook after college. My dad was kind of a bachelor assistant director. The details have never been exposed beyond that on a simple narrative, which is fine with me. And all my brothers went to the camp. Most of them were counselors, some of them are still involved with the camp. So it's a cool traditional place. But I always, when I first was introduced to prep schools during my freshman year, I went toured a couple schools out east. Groton especially reminded me of camp, but just the academic version of it. It was intense. There were like-minded people from all over the country, and it too kind of had this removed existence, almost as if you were going back in time.
Yeah, I think that that totally makes a lot of sense to me. So can you talk a little bit more about that? We understand how you were drawn to the camp or what the camp did for you, but then you talk about the relationship to Groton. I don't think many of our listeners, some of whom will definitely be some folks who went to Groton, but I think a lot of people don't know much about the school. Can you give us a little bit of a backdrop of why you were interested in Groton and just a little taste of what the school was like when you were there?
Yeah, I'll give you as best I can the perspective as a ninth grader looking at prep schools. I went to a nice, fancy, pretty academically rigorous day school in Indianapolis, and boarding schools weren't a thing people did unless you got into trouble or maybe you were recruited to play hockey. Our hockey rival was Culver Academy up in northern Indiana, which is another good school. So when I was curious about looking out east, because my experience going to camp in Maine, my dad had also taught briefly at Hotchkiss in the late 70s, and he would often compare our school in Indianapolis to Hotchkiss. And there's kind of this legendary existence of some mythic school out in Connecticut. And I wasn't as academically challenged as I wanted to be in middle school and high school. And I was also, frankly, looking for some separation and distance from my brothers who were I mean, they did everything before me. I wanted to go my own direction. And so one day I said to my dad something along the lines of, if Hotchkiss is so great, why don't we go there? And his response was something along the lines of, well, boarding schools are places to send kids where parents send kids when they don't want to parent them. I said, but it sounds great. You've told us all these stories about the English department and these legendary teachers. And that initiated checking these schools out. And I toured and interviewed at a couple schools, but it was Groton where I felt most at home. My dad insisted on breaking protocol and having me attend classes at all the schools where I visited and interviewed. Typically you were probably tour guide Bubba, but you do a walking tour, you get a sense of the place, you have your interview, and then you move on to the next school. But I went to a couple classes, including Warren Dilworth's, I think it was his 10th grade history class. And it was fun. It was engaging. People were smart. They just happened to be discussing early 18th century British naval history, which I got really into in fifth grade. And I answered a couple of questions, and I think it was after my second or third answer. He said, "Listen, you shut up. You know too much. I want to have my students speak too." And there was frankness to that class and humorousness to the exchange that I think really sparked my interest in that particular school. And I was lucky enough to get in and have parents who decided they would fund that phase of my education. But I had a similar experience in my revisit day. It felt friendly and familial. And I think that's something that's long distinguished the school and I hope continues to in the future.
Yeah, I absolutely love that insight that you have from the day you visited in the class and how that experience with that teacher made an impact on you, and it's something we're gonna revisit later. You went on after graduating from Groton, you went to Brown, and, you studied history, is that correct?
I studied history. Yeah. Maybe the most important kind of Groton Brown connection I can share is that I was not a great Latin student in high school. I had taken, I think, 3 years of Latin before. I know it's 2 years of Latin before I got to Groton. I would have been in Latin three at my old school. I didn't pass into Latin three, although I sat for one class with Dr. Reyes. And then I went down to Latin two, and I promptly flunked out of that and went back to Latin one. And I struggled. I took it for 3 years. I didn't take any modern languages, but I struggled. And at the end of my near graduation, John Tolp, who was my Latin three teacher and also a Brown grad, he said something along the lines of, "Look, I know Latin hasn't been the easiest thing for you, but don't give up on the classics, and especially don't give up on the classics at Brown. It's a really special department." And so when I had the option to request what was known as my CAP course, a freshman CAP course, basically a small seminar, I ended up with a great classicist basically taking Greek war making in translation. We read the Iliad and a couple other epic poems and all
Wow.
sorts of stuff. And that was an awesome experience. I think that my advisor, his name was Kurt Rothloff, spent more time reading my college application than the rest of the admissions office combined. He knew all the stuff I'd studied. He took a lot of interest in the woodworking I'd done at Groton. And Mr. Tulp was right that the classics department was a really special group of people. That first winter, he said, make sure you look out for my old advisor, Michael Putnam. And I met him after the Latin lessons and carol service, which was probably probably the only church experience I had after Groton. I don't know who's gonna listen to this. I did go to the Latin lessons and carol service every year, and I met Michael Putnam, and we became fast friends, and he took a lot of interest in my education. We would go out to lunch regularly. I took one class with him. He was is a scholar, virtual scholar, and when I wrote my senior thesis on the founder of Groton, he was an enormously helpful sounding board. So although I didn't take any Latin or Greek at Brown, I spent a lot of time with classics people, and a lot of the work I did was I almost double majored in ancient studies, but decided to pursue an honors course in history instead, which basically filled up the extra time where I wrote my thesis. But the influence of the classics department was strong, and especially the mentoring of those professors was strong.
Yeah, absolutely. We talk a lot on this show about the power of mentorship and the connection between finding something that you love to do, you love to enjoy to study or you enjoy to engage in, and then having someone who's kind of helping to shape that path for you or look out for you and answer questions for you. So it's really great that you had that connection with the teachers at Groton and then the professors at Brown. So when you finished at Brown, you ended up coming back to Groton to teach as an intern, right? Was there a delta of time there, or did you come right after graduation?
I came right after. I did spend part of the summer back in Indianapolis. I was working at my dad's construction company. One of my jobs that summer was replacing ceiling tile in a public school they were renovating downtown Indianapolis. And I ended up moving to Groton early. I was not interested in living at home for very long and chose the secluded boarding school life. I don't know, maybe 2 weeks earlier than I needed to be, but I was glad to get back out to the Northeast. And it was a 1 year gig and it was great. I was so closely removed from my time there that in a lot of ways, it felt like a continuation of where I had left off. The funny thing was, and it's only later being a teacher to realize this, is that people were so excited to give me jobs to do. And I thought, wow, this is amazing. No one can remember when I graduated, but they just want me to do whatever I want. I got to do stuff in the admissions office. I got to coach things. I was working 2 dormitories. People just say, yeah, this is great. We'd love to get you in there. And it was only later that I realized that they love pawning off work on me. I did all sorts of stuff. It was a 24/7 job often. And I mean, as you know, as a former student at the
Yeah,
school.
I mean, I think it's remarkable to me because obviously the high school we went to, we had a lot of really great teachers, and there are so many people who stand out in my mind as just legendary teachers, many of whom were there when you started, when you went, and then also when you were back teaching. So I guess what was it like stepping into the chute? You were teaching classes right away. Obviously, you were the junior person there. I think there was one other intern at the time.
Henry Walters that year.
Oh, okay, Henry Walters, yeah. He was a legendary guy himself, at least in the eyes of the students. So you step in, you've got all these teachers, many of whom have been there for decades, and you're the junior guy. Can you talk a little bit about that dynamic and what it was like to be, for lack of a better word, the lowest guy on a totem pole in a place that had a very strong faculty with a lot of tenure?
Yeah. I'll share two anecdotes that I think give you a sense of what it was like and also continue the mentorship theme. So I think it was my second week there. I went to see Doug Brown down in the woodworking shop. And for your listeners, Doug Brown, another legend, he taught at the school for 50 years. After graduating in 1957 and spending a couple years at Harvard, and then worked in an organ factory for 7 or 8 years before coming back. And he's got to be the most perceptive guy on campus and probably the funniest too. He kind of comes off as a curmudgeon when you first meet him, but really It just guy's got a heart of gold. And we're still in regular contact with one another. But I went down to the shop. This is back when it was down in the basement of 100 House. And I said, Mr. Brown, I'm swamped here. I'm way in over my head. I can hardly keep up with what I'm supposed to be doing. There's a lot of US history I don't even know that I hadn't learned in college, and the most knowledge I have goes back to my junior year of high school. And he cut me off and shared something that a mentor of his told him, I think in his first job. He said, look, you know more than everyone you're teaching. And it doesn't matter how much more you know, it just matters that you know more. That makes you the expert. Don't worry about it. Get back up there. And it was true. It was true. I mean, I did know a lot. I was, I think, pretty well qualified to teach. It just when you're first starting out, especially as a teacher, and you're one class ahead of your students, or you're getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning to prepare a class, you're going to be teaching 3 hours later for the first time, and doing that the next day and the day after that. It was a marathon experience, but that was important. That was an important reminder that I could do it. I could figure it out. I would figure it out, and I had good people around me to help. The other key experience that fall was coaching soccer with John Kramer. John Kramer is a brilliant mathematician and incredible photographer, and was also the third soccer coach. But I wouldn't describe him as an athlete, and I don't think he would describe himself as an athlete either. He's another guy I'm still in touch with and saw just recently. But my idea of athletics, and this is similar to my idea with a lot of things, was you charge hard and you win. Pretty simple. Be the best, train, charge, win. And he really helped me see a lot of fun in coaching. I mean, he helped me with my patience. I remember there was one time we were in a game. Some guys were close to the goal. These were probably classmates of yours, Bubba. And I yelled, fire it in the back of the net, fire that ball. And he kind of stepped closer to me and said under his breath, he said, I don't like telling the soccer players to fire things. This is soccer. This is not a battlefield. They don't need to fire it. They can just kick it. It really helped me. It really helped me calm down and remember the context, coaching third soccer. And
Which is freshman soccer.
yeah, and mainly we were out there to have fun and to stay in shape and maybe get some guys ready for JV, and I'm sure eventually some of them went on to varsity. But it was a good reminder just to relax and
Yeah.
have fun.
No, that's so cool, and it totally makes sense to me that as someone who's gone on to have a career in teaching, that doing an internship among so many wonderful teachers would lend itself to a lot of growth and a lot of perspective, even for someone who was a year out of college. So that's super cool. So after Groton, where was the next big teaching gig that you landed?
Yes, so I taught at Greenwich Academy for 3 years. I used to tell people it was the closest thing to a boarding school you could find without living on campus and going to classes on Saturday. But there were a bunch of boarding school people there, including a pretty incredible head of school who had been at St. Mark's for a long time before that. And she had lots of Groton connections and just a very competent person to work under. But I gotta say, after about 3.5 years, longer if you count my boarding school experience as a student, I was living in a very narrow, very preppy academic world. And I decided I want to get out, consider other options, other career options, and other places outside of that world. And I don't know if I actually went that far out of it. I went to grad school in London at LSE and got a master's degree in economic history. But that experience really helped clarify that I wanted to go back and teach. I wanted to be at schools. I had a couple funny interview experiences halfway through that were really clarifying in that respect. And I also decided that if I was going to go back and teach, I wanted to go to a different part of the country. I had a 2 week spring break window that year to go get a job, and I interviewed with some schools and places in the Northeast, and then got a call out of the blue from a school in San Diego, and was basically convinced by the assistant head, who was this really committed woman, Jenny Bjornstad. She was awesome, to come out to San Diego, which I'd never been to before. I had no concept of that part of the West Coast. I think I'd been to LA a couple times, but nowhere else. out west at that point, and it just seemed like it was a new school, seemed like a cool opportunity to be part of a place that was in building mode. And also an opportunity to live close to the outdoors, which was always a priority of mine. I'd lived in New York previously. I always felt like a dog without a yard there. Getting to Southern California, it honestly, it didn't make sense to me, and I don't know if you had this experience when you first moved out there, but I said, "Well, if I'm gonna move to the West Coast, kind of coastal California, I'm gonna move as close to water as possible." And I found this little surf bungalow, surf shack about 2 blocks from the ocean, and I remember seeing these grown men, I mean, probably my age now, and of course, now it makes sense to me having lived out there for almost a decade. Like grown men skateboarding by the beach and wearing flat brim caps, and like, "What is this? What are who are these man children?" And I called my older brother who had lived in, Claremont outside LA for a couple of years and said, "I just don't understand this place. I don't understand what these guys are doing. Shouldn't people be at work? What is going on here?" And he said, "Look, man, you gotta understand, Southern California is a giant playground for adults. And if you can't accept that, you're gonna have a miserable time and you should move." And so I took that to heart. Eventually learned how to surf, spent a ton of time in the water, did a lot of mountain biking out there, found a good crew of mountain bike buddies, a lot of road biking, and just tried to get outside as much as possible.
Yeah, that's awesome. So we talked a lot about your path out to kind of those full high school gigs. And so two areas I want to focus on. One is the classroom, what it was like to be a teacher, and I've got something that specifically from your CV that I want to ask about. And then two, you did a lot of work in leadership positions amongst the faculty. Of course, now you're the chair of your department at your current school. And so I think there are a lot of interesting lessons to be learned from those two experiences, both leadership in the classroom and leadership, peer leadership within the department. So getting into that, this one quotation I have from your CV, which is about how you actually organize the classroom. And so it says, all of my classes embrace the democratized classroom model. They are discussion based, writing intensive, and student centered. All students have a voice. Can you talk about why that matters, why you have that kind of mission in the classroom, and then how you bring that to bear with the students?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I think, a lot of the ideas in that line they're not original to me, but they've come from working with influential people. And that democratized classroom phrase comes from a former colleague of mine named Kathleen Kelly, who was really helpful in basically reorienting my classroom away from me, the master teacher or master teacher wannabe on the stage, forming, charismatic, funny, workshopping my jokes and my lines in my morning class to use in my afternoon class. And always, this is the pitfall of that, always trying to cram more content into an hour-long block and get students more involved in understanding history. I think to help people envision what I'm talking about, imagine having a meal together where you are sitting in rows eating your lunch, watching someone else eat his lunch at the front of the dining room. I think that's how a lot of classrooms are set up. You're not talking to anybody, you're just watching. You wait for the guy at the front to take a bite, and then you take a bite. He takes a drink, you take a drink, and you become really good at imitating someone. And the better you are at imitating that person, and that person might be really good at eating lunch, then the better you appear to be. But do you know how to do it on your own? And I think when I was the longer I taught, especially after graduate school, I kept saying to myself, I can't believe I've taught, say, my US history survey and didn't include this chart about imports and exports during the Gilded Age. I've got to get that in there. Or I can't believe I left this thing out. Or I can't believe I left that out. And I just found I was always running out of time. There's always more stuff to add. And I think my students were really getting squeezed as a result. And I thought about what were my best teaching experiences, and I always went back to the outdoors. And the whole idea with teaching in the outdoors and instruction in the outdoors is that you put people in a position to need you less and less over the course of time that you're together. And I really think that defines my teaching in the classroom. And I tell students this at the beginning of the year is that I want you to need me less by the end of the year than you do today. I want you to be more confident in what comes out of your mouth. I want you to be more confident in the ideas that come from your head. And over time, I will increasingly become a sounding board, but I'm not going to be the filter through which all of your ideas pass through. And I say good, bad, good, bad, good, bad. And I think a lot of people have an understanding as a teacher as someone who should be that filter and that you need that person. And without your teacher, how can you understand anything? But I think that's a really limited outlook on teaching because everyone graduates eventually, but you're not done learning. So how do you set students up to graduate and continue learning with confidence? I think you turn over more of the classroom to them. It's not a free for all. I mean, there are definite rules. I think coaching is maybe a better analogy here that you're teaching your students how to play the same way you would teach your team how to play. And you're showing them moves and positions. They're getting time on the field. And you're still on the sidelines reminding them where they need to be, how they can improve, debriefing after games. But it's really different from watching your coach play and you sit on the bench, even though your coach could totally hit the slap shot better than you can or put the ball in the back of the net. You gotta let people play. You gotta let them get on the field. And a lot of this experience, this came from working with other people, especially when I was at Bishop's. There were many faculty members who had spent time at Exeter, and I got to know Exeter people when they came out to our campus. And they helped me see a different way to teach. And with regarding history, one that was much more oriented towards primary sources than I had taught before. I used to think good teaching was me knowing more and me saying more. And my students, the kids who tended to be most successful in my classes were the students who were most like me. And I just realized I was leaving people behind. And that wasn't my job to make people like me. My job was to figure out what students could do on their own and help them do more on their own. Is that making sense, Bubba?
That no, that's awesome. That's huge, and I think that it's interesting you mentioned Exeter because I know, you did some work with the Exeter Humanities Institute, right? And so they teach the Harkness method. I'm familiar with that, but can you describe their pedagogical approach? What is the Harkness method?
Yeah, I'll try to give you the most distilled version. The architecture of the classroom is really important in the Harkness method. You move from rows to sitting around an oval table. So you're facing people and the teacher is on the same plane as the student. And that's really where the idea of the democratized classroom comes from in a sense of the physical space. And instead of having prepared lecture notes every class, although people will still lecture, they still show films. It embraces a wide variety of pedagogies. But as one instructor, this guy named Kwasi Boati, said to me at the end of one of these training weeks with extra faculty, I said, Kwasi, how do you know when you're doing it right? How do you know when you're doing Harkness correctly? What is the orthodox version? And he kind of laughed and smiled at me. And he said, you can do whatever you want in a Harkness classroom. The important thing pedagogically is what are you coming back to? You should be coming back to the student voice. And what he meant by that is that it's a pedagogy that places a lot of emphasis on asking questions and finding answers to those questions in the text that everyone shares and has in front of them. Yeah, I'd say 95% of anything that I've taught, my students theoretically have already read for homework or will
Yeah.
read in the coming evening. And so instead of a classroom where there's a lot of content repetition from the teacher or the teacher outlining a really lengthy textbook, the assumption is that students come well prepared to class. They have a working knowledge of the content. And then you get into the nuances of the content, especially with primary sources, by asking questions and interrogating the text. And I think when you add writing to that, for example, I might ask a question in class and having students find imagery in the Declaration of Independence. They'll have read the Declaration for homework, but when we sit down in class, I will give them time to look through the Declaration for imagery and then write some examples in their notebook and then use that to prompt discussion. And so I think that the writing serves as an equalizer because the students who, again, are the most extroverted, the most comfortable speaking off the cuff, they've got to hold back. And it gives people who might need a little bit more time to collect their thoughts to have that time and then have something in front of them that they can share. And that's a totally different model than me saying, all right, let me ask myself this question and I'll give you the answer. Ta-da. I
Yeah.
mean, great, but then what happens when I'm not there? And I think
Yeah.
that's always the question. What happens when I'm not there? Can you think about something on your own? Can you make sense of it? Can you come up with something original? Are you confident in that assertion? Those are all things that I'm trying to train.
Yeah. No, that's incredible. I think it's easy for people to say something almost not tongue in cheek, but without fully understanding what they're saying every student has a voice, right? Which I think a lot of people would take as we value everyone's opinions equally in the classroom. We encourage everyone to share in the classroom and everybody's voice will be heard. But hearing you talk about your actual approach, it sounds more like you're helping to build and fortify each student's voice in the sense that you want every student to be able to think and be able to articulate what their thoughts are in an effective manner with that kind of chorus that comes back. What do you do when I'm gone? And it kind of an interesting thing came into my head, which I'm sure this won't be the last time in the show. And I apologize if I'm a huge nerd, but I recently was going back through the Harry Potter series. And in the fifth book, the professor who sucks, Dolores Umbridge, she says, the point of this class is to pass the test. And one of the protagonists is basically like, no way, we're training for what's actually out there. And so it's really awesome to hear you articulate that we're not training high school students, we're not teaching high school students so they can pass the AP or so they can graduate. That certainly is a thing that we would like to see. But really what we want, and I think what makes teaching, especially in high school, so powerful, is helping to develop people into thinkers so that then they can take that next step, whether it's in college or not. They actually have created and have a voice that they can express and they can think about things critically. So that's really awesome that that's such a big part of your instruction.
Yeah, it's huge. There's got to be rigor and integrity to the teaching approach. Otherwise, it's just talking, and it can easily devolve into uninformed debate. And that's the opposite of how I try to teach. Uninformed debate. It's like there doesn't need to be a winner. There needs to be understanding, and there needs to be a shared understanding working from some kind of collective text.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing that really stands out to me is your focus on being writing intensive. Aaron McLean, whom I've mentioned before, and he actually has a really awesome podcast called The School of War. But he was the instructor of the year at the Naval Academy when I was there. Just a really incredible teacher. And he recently wrote a speech he delivered that was then published as an essay where he talks about the importance of writing and the kind of the dangers of AI in the classroom when it comes to writing. And not having read it recently, I won't try to articulate everything he said, but my takeaway from it was effectively that being able to write and express yourself is basically the ability to think. If you can't write effectively, you can't communicate your ideas, are you really capable of thinking? And so that was something that he brought up with the introduction of LLMs in the classroom and how great they can be at writing, obviously flawed in many ways, but how that can kind of ruin the growth of a student, especially in high school at a younger age, from being able to think and being able to articulate if you can just get it to spit out of a machine. So that certainly makes the writing intensive nature of your instructive approach very valuable or makes a big impact on me in that. So it was a little bit of a 90-degree turn there, but obviously you've been teaching for a long time. What are some of the challenges that you're seeing in the classroom today that you didn't see 10 or 15 years ago?
I think the biggest one is just the distraction of devices. I don't have their names off the top of my head. I went to a great conference a couple of years ago called Learning in the Brain, and the emphasis was on technology and adolescent development. There's this really funny guy. His first name was Jared, Dr. Jared something. He said, yeah, phones are great. Laptops are great. I mean, these are incredible machines and they're designed, for you to be on them all the time. They're the most addictive things that mankind has ever invented. And it's just incredible what they can do. But, using a laptop or a phone to teach, you can use it. You can use the calculator function, but it's a bit like sitting down with a table of recovering drunks and teaching them about liquid volume using beer pitchers. It's like, that's right. All they're going to be thinking about is the beer. And I think the biggest challenge is, I'll say the biggest challenge is getting people to put down the devices and just think. And most of the stuff I do at my level, even teaching 12th graders, we don't need devices. I mean, you can use word processors to speed up putting thoughts down on paper. Certainly they're incredible for research. I mean, that's the best thing that devices offer right now, I think, for history students and history teachers is the digitalized archives expand every day. It's awesome. But the reliance on them and the reliance increasingly, and this is going to sound cliche, for machines and AI to think for you, I think is bad. But I'll say this too. This probably 7 or 8 years ago at this point, I was leading an outdoors trip with some high school students to Yosemite, and we collected phones before students got on the bus driving from San Diego up to Northern California. And they lapsed back into what I would recognize as pre-device behavior within minutes. Nobody wanted their phones back. Nobody was freaking out because they didn't have their phones. They had their friends. And I always think about that when people worry, have we crossed a threshold from which we cannot return, where people are addicted to their devices and kids are going to be forever messed up? I don't think so. I think as teachers, we can help students and one another put them down. It's best done collectively. I think most of the work that I do in my classroom, again, it emphasizes text. I do like having hard copies of text because there are fewer distractions that way. And it emphasizes good faith approach to the table where you're sharing ideas and allowing other people to take risks. And it emphasizes eye contact and kind of all the behavioral things that go along with working together with other people and collectively trying to discover something that maybe you couldn't do on your own. Writing with AI is certainly a challenge. I don't think I need to go into that. I think people probably know about it who are listening to this podcast or have read about it. And there's a broad trend of more writing by hand happening in classrooms, which is, it has its limitations too, especially when it comes to drafting and refining your thoughts. But I think it takes discipline and practice for students to, I shouldn't say like not I'm not talking about abstinence from devices, but just use them less and live in the moment more, whether that's in the classroom, in your history classroom, or having lunch with your pals, or driving to school. I talk to my students all the time that you never get these minutes back when you're 17 taking US history with some of your best friends of your life. Who cares what's happening across the world in a different time zone with some stupid video? And they roll their eyes like, "Oh, you sound just like my grandpa, blah, 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 blah." But there's a real element of what are you missing when you're like this? I think a lot. I think it's a shame. I think people are robbing themselves of these incredible moments. And I think specifically of high school students where you're in this incredible age. You're young, you're smart, you're ambitious, you're energetic, you're hungry for knowledge. There's all this cool stuff you can do. Get up, get off your device, go
Yeah.
do it, go check it out, go live.
No, it's great, and hearing you talk about that, you can see why it would be such an energizing thing to engage with high school students and to teach them, especially ones who are as engaged as a lot of the students that you've had, just in terms of how exciting it can be to work with that group. One thing I'll say just about devices in the classroom is that at Wharton, a lot of the courses, almost like to a T, do not allow laptops in the classroom, and there are a lot of reasons for that. I mean, obviously, people could be distracted. I think you named a lot of the good reasons for having hard copies of things. But another thing that is interesting is they've found through academic studies that if you're listening to a professor speak and you have a laptop where you can type what they're saying, what a lot of students do is they end up becoming a stenographer and just typing everything they're saying. They're not actually processing what they're saying. So that's one thing that they've identified that was kind of novel to me that I hadn't thought of. But they do allow in a lot of classes tablets where they can be flat on the table and you can be writing. So that was really incredible. A lot of really nutrient dense stuff we just covered, especially about teaching in the classroom, leadership in the classroom. So I want to kind of pivot to a lot of your work as a chair of a department and as a leader among the faculty. So I'd be very interested, what are some of the challenges that you face when you're running a meeting full of other instructors who have just as much, if not more, experience than you, and some of who might be brand new, just like you were when you were at Groton as an intern. What are some of the dynamics when you're having those meetings, and what are some of the challenges that you face?
Yeah, I think the experience thing is exactly right. Especially I found with people who are basically the same age and have the same amount of experience as I do. I often think back to a line from an old timer I worked with in northern Maine. This was in my 20s. I spent time with a guy named Gardner Defoe, who was a master Maine guide. He was almost exactly half a century older than I was. but just like the most incredibly vibrant, engaged, funny, tough dude I've probably ever met. And it was incredible. He never yelled unless we were in danger. He was a great canoeist and paddler and outdoorsman, but he never raised his voice to correct people, which was different from a lot of experiences I had growing up. And he would always find gentle ways to offer corrections and advice. And one line he used a lot, he would wait till the moment had passed, and he would sit down next to you and he would say, "Do you mind if I offer a suggestion?" And because he was so good at stuff, of course you wanted a suggestion, you were about to learn something, but it was such a nice way to say, "Would you please consider this? I think you could do it better." Instead of, "You're doing it wrong, do it this way." And I think that's a really important thing working with people in a in the history department, at schools, really anywhere, is to first observe them. As one of my former bosses said, catch people doing things well. You can acknowledge their strengths, get a sense of the whole person, and then offer them something. And I think when you shift from ordering to offering, it's a lot easier to consider or accept that offering. And I think it's a way of showing too that I'm not telling you how to redo everything you do in the classroom. I will never be in a position to do that. Even when I'm at the end of my career, observing people at the beginning of their career, they're going to be doing things that are great. But I think offering them suggestions is it's a more congenial way, convivial way of working with people than ordering.
Yeah, I think that's a really elegant way of approaching a lot of leadership problems, but certainly in kind of this peer leadership model where even though it's not exactly peer leadership if you're the chair of a department where it's definitely an authority position with legitimate hierarchical endowments, but it kind of goes back to a theme we've talked a lot about is just asking people for their input as opposed to making decisions immediately. This is kind of the inverse of that, where rather than telling them what to do immediately, you're offering them an option to consider. And I think by approaching it that way, you're kind of acknowledging their innate ability and their value in a way that allows them to see what you're saying. Also, it's although should not be the reason why you do this, I think it's a great way of managing people who do have a lot of self-confidence or in a worse manifestation of that, a little bit of arrogance or cockiness. By offering them in a somewhat deferential manner, the suggestion, they may be more open. Because a lot of people do have that somewhat defensive mechanism when you go to offer them any feedback. So by serving it up the way that you described, I think that makes a lot of sense.
I think the other element is this is I mean, this is gonna sound also totally unoriginal, is I think you've gotta start what are your first principles from which everything else flows? I mean, I've spoken pretty extensively about my classroom, and one of my principles is to make sure I hear from every student, every class, hear something from them, and to have students, I would say in almost every class, take time to write something down. And if you don't have those principles or you're not clear on them, I think it's really difficult to maintain any sense of integrity, whether it's classroom or department, because you have to know, what are we doing here? What's the purpose of this? How can I give someone advice or ask them a question about their approach if we don't have some kind of standard we're comparing it to, the distance from that standard and how we get closer to that standard?
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense to me, and I think another thing that comes with that is also having clear expectations. So internally, you have, the metrics against which you're measuring yourself. But I think also when you're in that leadership position, having the clearly laid out expectations, and I think what a lot of what we're talking about here has to do with dependability and not being entirely unpredictable. Like, of course, you don't necessarily need to do the same thing all the time, but I think by having a clear standard, holding people to the standard, meeting the standard yourself, you create an environment where people understand expectations and they know that certain things are going to be taken care of, and you're able to focus on other issues. I just had a great conversation with Kevin Sullivan. We were talking about this a little bit, and it comes down to if you're able to take care of those expectations and those things are being met and the standard is being held, you're able to access such a higher level of debate, such a higher level of performance, right? Like in that case, we were talking about medicine. I mean, it certainly applies to aviation. I can't teach you how to, manage an objective area if you can't stay on altitude and on airspeed and within the holding area that you're supposed to be in. Like that's a fundamental baseline. But once you've demonstrated your ability to hold that standard and meet that expectation, we're now able to think about that higher level, that next level problem set. And so it is interesting to think about that in the context of the classroom or within the boardroom as well when you're meeting with the department. If everybody's meeting the standard, everybody's meeting those expectations that you've set as the leader and you're meeting them yourself, you're able to then engage with the stuff that, you're having a meeting for, right? Or you're in the class to talk about, if the students didn't do the homework, it's so much harder to teach them, right? But once everybody's done the homework and once everybody's shown up ready, you're off to the races.
That's exactly right. And my feedback does look and sound differently when the non-negotiables are not being met. You know, homework's a good example for students. I'm not going to say, tell me about your outlook on why you didn't do your homework, Bubba. This is how did you approach that? It's like, hey, listen, if you didn't do your reading, that might be okay, but you're not going to have anything to say in class today. So just got to sit this one out. I hope you do it next time. And in fact, I expect you to do it next time so that you can engage in discussion and meet us on that higher plane.
Well, yeah, and I think that it really reminds me a lot of the differences in flight instruction when I was in flight school versus when I was actually learning in the fleet. The idea that for every flight you had effectively homework. There were these things called discussion items, and you were supposed to be able to talk through every discussion item. And these are all things that realistically, the only way you're going to know about them is by reading about them, but they're all things that you will do in the plane and that have a higher level of understanding that will be required of you eventually. But setting the foundation with the reading and being able to talk about those things then enables when you have that discussion for the instructor to give you the things that aren't in the textbook, right? But if you show up without having done that reading, now all of a sudden it's like, okay, the instructor's got to try and teach you for what you were supposed to have read. And I mean you can engage with all this stuff. And depending on what you're teaching, what part of the curriculum you're in the high school, how close you are to the finish line, like, it could be unrecoverable. Certainly in the plane, if you couldn't sit and talk through a profile that you were going to fly, it would be a lot more challenging to do it when you're flying, 240 miles per hour or what have you. It is, I think it's super important to set those expectations and come in and uphold the standard as well. And I know I'm going off a little bit on I'm talking a little bit longer than I would normally want to, but there's an aspect of this that is really important to me too, and it is an insight that I've had in peer leadership evolutions in my own life. And I always think about the times that I've been, when it was in the military or when I was, in some smaller leadership capacity in high school or something, it was like how hard it was to hold people or to get people to do what you wanted them to say when you have realistically no legitimate authority over them. You might have nominally like a named job where you're appointed over them, but they're all your peers, all that stuff. I found that it was super easy if everybody did what you asked them to do, and it was super difficult when people didn't. I mean, I think that that's obvious. That's true about all leadership evolutions, but I think an important takeaway from that is that when you find yourself in the follower position in a peer leadership context, it's important for you to be a good follower. And
Yeah.
even though you might not have, you're not the one in charge, and that person realistically might not be a good choice for the job. In order for an organization to function correctly, there does have to be a single leader. And if it's that person, okay, do what you can to support them when they ask you to do basic things that aren't in violation of your morals, your ethics, or any regulations. Like, do your best to be supportive and do those things, because when you flip the script on that, and you're the other person on the other side of that, it's so challenging. So that's why, like, in as much as we're looking at instructorship as leadership, it's also what you learn about leadership as a student and how much damage you do to a classroom environment if you don't do your homework beforehand. Because yes, you have to sit this one out, But now if you've got, say it's a small class, you've got 12 kids in a class and one kid basically has nothing to offer to the discussion, you've now degraded a significant proportion of what could have been a high functioning classroom environment.
Absolutely. I think one of the most important things I've learned just, and again, it's something totally unoriginal, is how you deliver, the tone that you use. And I try to be really direct with people and try to be really concise. And I try to be gentle when I'm giving people feedback so they can actually hear what I'm saying. Yeah, it's like I think back to that John Kramer moment on the sidelines of the soccer game. He didn't have to yell at me or tell me to shut up or say, "I'm the head coach here, you can't say fire." But he put it in a way that I could hear what he was trying to say, probably more clearly than if it had been delivered with more ferocity.
Yeah, absolutely. I also would just one thing to add on that is if you are the type of person who shouts a lot, that can be effective in some instances, but certainly in a high intensity environment, if you're the type of person who gets upset about everything, then you're effectively upset about nothing. If you're constantly operating on a 9 or a 10 in terms of intensity, then when the situation is intense, you have nowhere to elevate to communicate that appropriately. So that's why, you see in so many instances, the ideal of the military aviator is just like laid back person, even though what they're doing is very intense, because you should have some extra throw. It's like, and I would imagine I remember when I was in high school and different teachers I've had, it's the same thing. If teachers go high and to the right off every disciplinary issue with a kid, they're never going to respect or know or understand when they've actually crossed a line. So I think that by staying reserved and being more thoughtful about your feedback, that allows you in actually like you said about the guide you were working with in Maine, when he would actually raise his voice, something is legitimately unsafe or there's a legitimate issue because his normal operating baseline was so laid back or so mild tempered or mild mannered that when they would go and ratchet it up, you actually paid attention. So I think that that's a huge part of tone as well.
Definitely. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So we're running up on time here. We're able to talk a lot about the classroom. We spent a lot of time talking about just growing up and hanging out in SoCal, which is pretty sweet as well. We spoke quite a bit about the classroom, a little bit about leadership on the peer level. But as we end this thing, I'd be very interested. I ask this question to everybody at the end of each show, but I'm pretty interested in what your thoughts would be. If you could give one leadership trait or one coaching, mentorship, or teaching trait that you think would be of value for any young person to cultivate or any aspiring leader to cultivate, what would it be?
Say it's a sense of humor. I mean, how do you cultivate that? I don't know. You're probably a much better coach for that than I am. But it just having a sense of humor puts things in perspective and puts people at ease. I remember this was so funny. The graduation must have been this was Groton graduation 2008. I was sitting next to the Myers who were back. Actually, Myers was back as a sabbatical sub for a semester. Sitting next to her and her husband Warren, who'd been my Latin teacher, and both of them, when they came back, my social life on that campus just quadrupled in fun intensity, even though they were in their 70s. But in the middle of somebody's very serious speech, a little kid, a sibling, maybe one of the Sky kids, I don't know, took off across the circle and everyone turned. And this kid was just kind of going bonkers and running in loops. Who knows? A little kid. And then some adults got up, I think a parent and maybe an administrator or faculty member, and they were chasing this kid and and the speech stopped and it was just, it was so funny. And Micheline leaned over and she said, "Oh, let the child be. You don't have to catch him. It's school. It's like a family. It's messy. Just be okay with some mess." And it's like, yeah. I mean, it was so funny watching them try to chase this kid down. The speech is stopped. It was all so serious and just need a little bit of humor to put things in perspective and remind people this is a school, this is a graduation. Stuff like this happens at a school, even on graduation day. It's going to be fine. And I think without a little bit of humor, you don't have the pressure release valve that you need, I think, to be a leader and to work with a group and to get a group working all in the same direction. And I think, Bubba, you're a great example of that. I imagine you were an incredible pilot in part because you know how to diffuse tense situations with a joke or some self-deprecating comment.
I do love a nice self-deprecating comment. It is an interesting insight to look back on it because everybody has an arc and everybody has growth, and I think when I was so crazy in aviation, how you go from like, one day being the junior guy and then all those guys leave, all the senior guys leave, they get new orders, they go to a new place, and all of a sudden you get a bunch of new guys and you haven't moved at all. But the relative scale, you become the senior guy. And I certainly think there was a period of time when I was more intense and I had some really helpful conversations with some mentors of mine. I think of my buddy Jelly, whose real name I'll keep off the air. We had some really important conversations about instructorship, and that's when I was able to bring more of my normal personality, which is a little bit more humor intensive, into the cockpit. And I think that it did make for a much better team within the cockpit as opposed to me kind of like white knuckling the co-pilot and being like, fly better, and then expecting them to fly better. It wasn't exactly helpful. I will say one more thing though. You mentioned John Kramer and you mentioned my sense of humor at a meeting with the eighth grade prefects when I was a prefect as a senior. I was making light of a situation that he did not think was very humorous, and he told me, and I won't do an impression because he has an inimitable voice. He said, "You think you're funny, but you're not." And it sticks with me still to this day that I might not be as funny as I think I am, but I think that's an absolutely fantastic insight, how humor can bring a level of levity to a team, I think in both her high intensity environments, but then also when we self-induce the intensity, because sometimes we lose that perspective. So humor can help ground us, get us to step back and see that it's maybe not as intense as we feel like it is.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, so Mr. Nagler, thank you so much for educating us today. It has been really cool to chat about leadership in the classroom as well as peer leadership, and also to reminisce about the formative experience we both had at Groton School in Massachusetts. So thanks so much for being on the show.
Anytime. I'm honored to be here and look forward to start listening to your series. It'll probably be the first podcast I actually subscribe to.
Yeah. No, hey, one more thing.
Curious.
We talked about how I might want to talk to a baker. I think it might make sense to do a little shout out. Is there a baker in your life that has an establishment in Charleston that people should attend?
She's cranking out the dough right now at Grit Bakery. It's my wife, Allison. She's crushing it. The product is incredible. Space is great, but really the bread speaks for itself. The pastries speak for themselves. If you're in Charleston, you will not be disappointed with the stop at Grit.
Yeah, I could not agree more. I got to visit one time, and Grit Bakery is absolutely fantastic. The artist formerly known as the Little Wheat
That's
in
right.
San Diego. So if we have any SoCal transplants to the East Coast, make a trip down to Grit Bakery and increase your gluten intake, and you won't be sad.
That's right. That's right.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, Bubba. Good talking to you.
Thanks so much for listening to Lead with Bubba Scott. This episode was recorded and edited with Riverside.fm. Theme music developed with Suno AI. If you enjoyed the show, please follow and leave a review wherever you find your podcasts. And be sure to follow us on Instagram @LeadWithBubba and let us know your thoughts in the comments. See you next time.